Bob Andelman, and you're listening to and hopefully watching the Mr. Media interview with sports writer Jonah Keri, whose new book is The Extra 2%: How Wall Street Strategies Took a Major League Baseball Team from Worst to First. Two words: Albert Pujols.
Yeah.
I love that story. Tell that story to folks.
So we've read a couple of excerpts of the book. ESPN.com has one. That's the one about Albert Pujols. Deadspin.com has one about Vince Namoli. And we ran one at GQ, which is kind of a general,
Oh.
it's about arbitrage and about business concepts. And yeah, we got a great response from the ESPN.com excerpt. And I hope that people, when they read the extra 2%, they'll enjoy the story. There's a scout named Fernando Arango. He used to be with the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. He goes to Missouri, scouts this kid. Nobody's heard of this kid. It's not a hotbed at the time where he's scouting. Shortstop, huge shortstop, way too big to play shortstop, but athletic, in his opinion, the scout's opinion, athletic, a real future, big power hitter, hitting balls into the trees, everything looks good. Introduced, no problems, Spanish-speaking kid, everything is good rapport. They go to the next tournament. There's some people there. There's some scouts, and things are starting to happen, but Arango is a little bit apprehensive and nervous, but he thinks he still has a chance. He had an early rapport with this kid. Fine. They meet at a Denny's in another city, actually. Then they drive down to the Trop to do a tryout. According to Arango, this kid hits a ball off the foul pole and makes unbelievable plays. He's never caught in his life. Takes the catcher's mitt and all the equipment, pops out of his stance and throws down to second base very quickly. Just shows athleticism. Everything looks good. According to Dan Jennings, the scouting director at the time, bad body, terrible hitting approach, dipping his shoulder, stone hands, can't do anything right. This is the same guy. This is Rashomon taking place at Tropicana Field for you Kurosawa fans. And what inevitably happens is when the time comes for the draft, Arango says you have to draft this guy early. If not first round, then soon. First round, no. Second round, no. Third round, no. Even if there's disagreement, Fernando Arango vowed that this guy would hit 40 home runs. He was convinced of it in the major leagues, in a season. I don't mean in his career, in a season. They're going along, nothing's happening, 10th, 11th, 12th. Finally, in the 13th round, 402nd pick of the draft, the St. Louis Cardinals take a flyer on a pudgy kid from Missouri named Albert Pujols. And as the story goes, Arango quit his job over it because he was so disappointed in what happened. This is before Pujols went nuts, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Quits his job and puts champagne on ice. He leaves it in his icebox forever. And he says, when the time comes and this kid grows into a major league player and finally hits 40 home runs in the big leagues, I'm going to pop this champagne and I'm going to drink it with my wife. And they stay friendly. They stay in contact. Pujols calls him the night before a game or the day before that night's game. Sitting on 39 home runs, he says, it's going to happen. Hits 2 home runs that game. Calls him back after the game and says, you can pop the champagne now. I've got my 40 home runs. You hear these stories in baseball, and there's so much romance and stuff involved. But if you're a Devil Rays fan, there's no romance. You're thinking, why did we get Albert Pujols? That's what you're thinking.
Yeah, previously I actually, and maybe it's just with time I have forgotten. I'd never heard that story. I can't remember hearing that story. And when I read
Yeah.
it in the book, I went, oh, and you. This is one of the great keys to this book, and why people really need to get this book.
Mhm.
You build the drama to it
I don't
because
mention his name.
no,
For the whole story, I don't mention his name. I just say he's a pudgy kid, the player, the kid. I mean, I guess you could probably figure it out after a while, but it does take a while to get it right. There's suspense involved.
yeah, oh, it's a very good storytelling there.
Thank you.
Speaking of good storytelling, let's
Mhm.
talk let's talk a little bit about the king, at least in his mind, Vincent J. Namoli, the man who landed Tampa Bay the franchise when no one else could do it. Also, the man who I understand turned water into wine.
He did. Very successful in that respect, and we'll let you know about it. Yeah, the thing about Vince Namoli is he was very successful in the business world before he ultimately bought the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. He was what you'd call a turnaround specialist. Now, he did this with widget companies, with glass makers, with people, with companies that made items, hard, faceless items that could be sold. It's not a public trust to own a glass company or a container company or anything like that. You're just trying to squeeze profits, and that's all you care about. So being thrifty and being very aggressive in your business model and what have you, that can work. You're just talking about the bare bones. How can I get a profit margin? No problem. Can't do that with a baseball team. You can have a baseball team that has bargains and shops well and does things like that. And the new Rays are an example of that. But you can't go nuts with squeezing pennies, and you can't antagonize your employees. And this is what Vince Namoli did. famous for that. A Reign of Terror. One story which comes out in the book. There's a lot of stories in that. More stories per capita in that chapter than any other for sure. One of them is he didn't allow outside food. And this was just a cheapskate move, flat out. And by the way, many teams don't allow outside food, so it's not just him. But the way that he enforced it, Bob, this
Right.
was the thing. Ticket takers and ushers were taught to confiscate things or they'd be fired right away. And there's one famous story where an old folks home, they load up a bus, they go to a ball game. Wife and husband go up to the front of this. They're going to walk into the stadium. Wife's in a wheelchair. They're 80 years old. She's relatively infirm. She's got a little bag of cashew nuts, 15, 20 cashew nuts in the bag. This story has been told before, but it
Mm-hmm.
just killed me when I heard about it. And the usher, the ticket taker, basically says, no, you can't bring that in there. Husband starts arguing. Fight ensues. Wife says, I'm going to pass out. I could go into shock if I don't. No, 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 no. So they kick them out. They can't go into the stadium. All their friends from the old folks home are at the game. They go back to the bus. The sweltering bus, you know how the Florida heat is. For 3.5, 4 hours, they sit there and wait for everybody to come back, and finally they return. In the grand scheme of things, it's one story. It wouldn't make that big a difference. And I think if Vince Namoli had goodwill and somehow was just a rogue ticket taker, it would have been no problem. But because he had such a bad reputation, they buried him for it. He burned his bridges almost right off the bat with the local media to the point where it was antagonistic, not quite from day one, but definitely from day two, and then pretty much for the next 8 years in a row. It was really, really a tough situation for the locals and for Namoli, too. I mean, there was a lot of backlash, self-inflicted backlash, but I'm sure he didn't feel comfortable in that situation either.
Well, and of course, the funny thing is, and you tell this story, and I remember this very well. Not only could you not bring food in,
Mm-hmm.
if you were a reporter, you couldn't
Oh, yeah.
buy food and bring it in. There was the story of the reporter who got a pizza, paid money, put
Yeah,
money in Vince's pocket because I
yeah.
guess he didn't want to eat the food that was. People don't know this, I guess, but the sports writers and the media are provided food at these games that they cover because
Yeah,
it's tradition and it keeps them where they need to be and not
that's
wandering
right.
around. So this one reporter, I guess he just decided he wanted pizza that day, and
Yeah.
he went out and he bought a pizza. He paid Vince and the Rays for pizza, and Vince just had a meltdown over pizza. But the number of, I mean, Vince meltdowns. You have the story of him throwing the St. Pete Times out, the high school band that he wanted
Oh,
them to buy their
Dylan,
own tickets. Endless. It's just, and it was so wonderful to see you capture all these stories in one place.
I tried it, and the
Yeah.
thing is, I'm an outsider, Bob. I mean, we've talked about this. I live in New Hampshire, which is I don't know 1,500 miles away, and I'd only been to the area a couple of times. Period. And to go in, I really tried to just learn everything that I could. I think there's some advantages to being an outsider in some ways because you're not too close to the story. You don't have biases. Maybe you bring a fresh set of eyes. But by the same token, there's a learning curve. And I had lunch with Mark Topkin and Mark Lancaster, who was covering the sport at the time. And I talked to the mayor a lot. I was in the mayor's office quite a bit, actually, in the St. Pete City Hall. Just did a lot of that stuff, a lot of really just boots on the ground, just getting to know the old timers because you needed to have that information. There were basic things that I didn't know. And some things, I guess, you talk about being an outsider. When you go over the Howard Franklin Bridge from St. Pete to Tampa, there's a sign immediately that says, George Steinbrenner Field up ahead. It used to be called Legends Field, not George Steinbrenner Field.
Right.
I mean, for you, if you cross the bridge or anybody else, I'm sure it's like seeing a red light. It's nothing. But for me, I said, are you telling me that as soon as you leave the area, as soon as you leave St. Pete, they're actually marking their territory and declaring it the domain of the New York Yankees? I just thought
Yeah.
that was an amazing thing, and I reported in the book. And if you live in St. Pete, you say, oh, who cares? It's a dumb story. If you live anywhere else, you'd say, really? They're actually on the doorstep of the New York Yankees, even though the Yankees theoretically play also 1,500 miles away. I thought that was a very, very interesting little tidbit and indicative of the kind of rivalry that goes on locally.
Well, and I hadn't thought about it in this context before. I used to criticize the Rays a lot for not putting up billboards in Hillsborough County promoting
Yeah.
games and teams and stuff. And now that you mention it that way, I'm thinking that that may have had something to do with Steinbrenner.
Oh, yeah.
He may have found some way to keep them out of there. But then again, they didn't put billboards up in Orlando either, which I always thought was kind of dopey. This was under Namoli. I know that Sternberg has done things differently.
They have not capitalized on Orlando enough, by the way. The Sentinel never covers the team. It's a very
Yeah.
strange relationship because Orlando's not far away and a huge population base, even south of Orlando. And they're just not. They tried to capitalize on it. They played a series out there in the Wild World of Sports complex, and
Right.
it just didn't take for whatever reason, which is too bad because if they're only restricted to fans in St. Pete, that's a fraction of the area. You're talking about Port Charlotte all the way out to Orlando should all theoretically be in play, but it really isn't, unfortunately.
I'm hoping, frankly, I hate to say it because I love St. Pete and I love having the team 5 minutes away. I'm frankly hoping that folks in Tampa and St. Pete and Clearwater behind the scenes, which is a little difficult under the sunshine laws here, put their
Ooh.
heads together, find a way to cooperatively raise the money and put the team just across the water in Tampa somewhere, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. And it's just realistically
I don't
St.
know
Pete
why
can't
St.
do
Pete.
it.
I'm sorry, I was going to say I don't know why St. Pete would go for that, because the problem, you've got them in an ironclad lease and all the revenue is going to the city. Even if it's, right across the water, I'm okay with, but it almost seems like it has to be on the St. Pete side, because otherwise Sternberg would have to pay the city a huge bounty to get out of it. St. Pete has no motivation to cede the team to Tampa or Brandon or anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah, there would have to be some serious negotiations. Maybe I'm wrong, and I don't live there, but having done the research and certainly having talked to the former mayor, and I know the current mayor shares the same view, they're not going to give it up without a fight, and I don't blame them.
Well, the economy is such that it may as it's doing in all kinds of things all around the country. I think
Yeah.
eventually it's going to change the rules for how that decision is ultimately made.
Yeah, well, Tampa's got their own problem with the Buck Stadium too. This is not an easy
Yeah.
scenario, no
No,
matter.
and as we said, I don't think there's a lot of cities lying in wait anymore. There's no stalking horse really.
That's right.
There's people who'd like to have a team for their community. I understand that, but um, well, look, I could go on talking about this for hours. It's been my book came out oh my God, 18 years ago. I worked on it starting in 1990, I think. So this has been a part of my life for a long time. I'm going to hold your book up again. I'm very happy to turn over responsibility for the legend that is the Tampa Bay Rays and Devil Rays to you, my friend. Um, and folks, listen, you can find Jonah Keri's new book, The Extra 2%, How Wall Street Strategies Took a Major League Baseball Team from Worst to First, at great bookstores everywhere, or you can order it online right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. Also, check out Jonah Keri's cleverly titled podcast, it's called Jonah Keri's Podcast. You can check that out at Jonah Keri, it's JONAHKERI.com, or you can subscribe for free on iTunes. And Jonah Keri, thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media today.
Thank you for having me, Bob. In 18 years, I hope that we both get to pass the torch to the next ingenue who will write a great book about the Tampa Bay Rays.
Fair enough, fair enough. And folks, listen, for more original interviews with your favorite sports writers, surf over to our main website, mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. Subscribe to Mr. Media on iTunes and you'll never miss a show. Just search Mr. Media Interviews from within iTunes and subscribe for free. You can also listen, as my friend Jonah does in New Hampshire, with a piece of string and a tin can in many locations. If you've got an idea for a guest, you've got a comment on today's show, or would like to advertise on Mr. Media, email me directly at bob@mrmedia.com, and you can follow Mr. Media on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us today. Always appreciate you giving up a little piece of your day and spending it with Mr. Media. Thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.
Hey, did you know that you can listen to the latest Mr. Media on your phone with the Stitcher app? Stitcher is smart radio for your smartphone. Mr. Media is on demand and on the go with Stitcher. Download Stitcher for your phone today. Get the free download at Stitcher.com. That's STITCHER.com.